tonight's event was an opportunity for us to invite Uma Breakdown and Johanna Hedva together in person on the occasion of Hedva's current book tour, following the release of their third published book, and Uma's upcoming solo exhibition at FACT, Earth AD 2, which is on the second leg of its 3-venue tour from Wising Arts Centre, where it was shown in 2022, to FACT, where it will open October 20th, and to Quad in Derby in 2024. Hedva was Uma's mentor during their residency with Abandon Normal Devices artist-led Unseen Futures Fellowship Programme in 2022 to 23. And alongside a shared interest in horror films, gothic and noir tropes, the occult, heavy metal music, and the heightened emotions and spirituality that complements all of these, they also similarly define as disabled goth queers. Johanna Hedva is a Korean-American writer, artist, and musician who was raised in Los Angeles by a family of witches and now lives in LA and Berlin. Hedva is the author of the novels Your Love Is Not Good and On Hell, as well as Minerva, The Miscarriage of the Brain, which is a collection of poems, performances, and essays. As a musician, their albums are Black Moon, Lilith in Pisces in the 4th house, and The Sun and the Moon. Their work has been shown internationally, and their essay, Sick Woman Theory, was published in 2016, has been translated into 11 languages. Uma Breakdown is an artist, writer, and award-winning game designer interested in animals, horror, and queer feminist literature. Everything they make is about some combination of love, grief, hallucination, and an excess of joy. In 2020, they finished a PhD titled Becoming a Human, about the evil dead, care, trans, écriture, feminine, and disaster. With Belladonna Paloma, they make video games about the divine and occult providence of trans femme existence. Recent projects include the speculative dismemberment of Agent Leon Kennedy for Market Gallery in Glasgow, Hinterlands at Baltic, The Joy of Destruction for Backlit in Nottingham, Elan Vitale for Container Magazine in Bristol 2023. They're currently finishing The Well of Sickness Shimmering, which is a video game about holy wells, also made with Bella Paloma, due to launch at the Overkill Festival in the Netherlands in November. Tonight's event will feature short readings by Uma and then Hedva, and will be followed by a free-ranging conversation between them about film, art, writing, music, queerness, disability, anything that takes their fancy. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Uma. Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be able to hang out and talk with my friend Johanna here. I'm always in awe of their work, and it's very difficult to be the opening act for someone you admire so much, but I'm going to try. So I'm going to read you a couple of things. I'm going to read you a little text from the Earth AD zine, which is like a free publication that went with the touring show Earth AD. It's kind of a mixture of it's mainly the kind of like stories that I wrote in order to develop the show. I'm going to read you a little bit of this. I sing softly to myself, unconcerned with either my uncertainty of the lyrics or my ability to hold the tune. The paddle dips into the water on one side of the canoe and then the other, a rhythm that I sing to, mostly. Above, if I were to look up, the sky is oppressive. It is more in common with the visual artifacts in video reproductions or from eyes under stress than something with genuine depth. I dreamt once of a huge eye following me. The eye was so large that I could barely make out its curve. To the untrained, it may have appeared just as a black sky, but I was too aware that it was a hanging pupil, with the iris beginning just at the horizon if only the mountains did not obscure it. That dream stayed with me, and when I push it down with my work, and now it surfaces in my memory once again, and so I try not to look at the sky above my rhythmic paddling, in case I summon that dream to come to me the next night, when I must lie at the bottom of my canoe, the sky feeling as if it's only a few inches from my face. And because I like to be kind of difficult, and because Johanna is reading something that's actually published, I'm going to read you a thing from a book that came out at the beginning of the year. The book is called The Wet and Heavy Noise, and it's a kind of publication of writing from artists in the north of England and in Scotland that was put out by Market Gallery in Glasgow. And the text that I have got in this is one of my best titles, which is The Speculative Dismemberment of Agent Leon Kennedy. I am a person who's like fascinated with certain things, and they stick in my head, and I kind of return to them over and over again. And one of those things is the Resident Evil video games. I'm really interested in Agent Leon Kennedy. And one of the other things that I'm very interested in is Dracula in its kind of weird form as a kind of selection of letters. And in one way, Dracula is a story of a person who is really upset with their lawyers and really upset with, you know, the complicated administration they must go through in selling property. So I'm going to read you a bit of this, which is a collection of my letters to Agent Leon Kennedy. Prologue. I'm sorry to have to tell you, but you've been placed in a cauldron of shit. I hope you understand the dance of emotions impeding things. You are tied to a mule and dragged naked through town in a bad way. Your image both cursed wretchedly and vulnerable. You hear laughter from the approach to the castle. A tree falls, flattening your prospects. I'm sorry to have to, but I must make the dance of Exclusia. Leon Kennedy should never have come to the castle in the Arklay Mountains. There's a limit to my tolerances. Your toes fall off at the most embarrassing opportunity and your eyes bulge. The dance of definitions and punctuated generosity slams shut, flattening your foot. 0. I know you're coming to visit me, Agent Kennedy. Your head on a distant shore. I've received the missive outlining the various irregularities in my estate. You will have left the port at Limehouse. My associate is no longer walking through the agency you represent. But by the end, when a tree falls, you will care. Your mind bulges, attracting the autofocus of the interview camera. My dance of humours throws back into the bonfire now. I mean, you were little more than sleeping. You were never seen, hands still bound. I hope you understand. I will be sailing for my family's home here on the mainland. The dance of the travelling, the curling disgust for auditors, the hatred for brokers. Yours will always be lacking in contrast to the next candidate. Your crotch bulges water in the centre of the frame. You're on the other side, about to ask your question. You dream of being lost at sea in a bad way, but barely more than a chance to return. I hope your paperwork is now finished. Your head on a plate, drinks, coughs, mouth the symbol of the dance of phlegm passing a mushroom, exhaling abruptly. The cat turns away from you, revolted by your behaviour. You're called a redacted by teenagers in the park. Everyone dances around you. You are unhappy, but no one takes it particularly seriously. You're always seen. A period of a few seconds to pay off the dance of property. There is nothing that could be done otherwise. There is a sound of some agency papers being flicked through, perhaps your notes or maybe an agency file, on an interview on a clipboard, perhaps a combination of all three. My own pleasure, as I wait for you, the dance of the addressee. Know, though, that I have decided to spend this time writing to you, Agent No Time, in the shape of your agency's London office, outlining the various ways in which you will meet your end. There is a silence that comes before someone even clears their throat. You will light the glass cauldron of shit, marred only slightly by your cat-handedness, elated mania, what makes you human, impeding things in your head on a different trajectory. There is nothing that could be done otherwise. You have pine mouth. You grow the ears of a bat in a bad way. Look down, my associate's fingers against the quartz tabletop. I intend to kill you before the world. May your life end in administration. Footnote 1. I only wrote to you recently, but I forgot to include this. I dreamt this afternoon that your coach had overturned. There'd been a horrible accident. You'd been thrown violently against some rocks, little bits of you everywhere, somehow still twitching on their own, your head balanced on a mossy stone with a look of absolute mortified embarrassment. In the moonlight above you, where your decapitated head no longer has the capacity to turn and look, was a dreadful and handsome rider carrying a huge scythe and a shield. In contrast to yours, his face, while politely rugged, now think of John Hamm, looks extremely disappointed. I just want you to know about this dream in case there's anything you can do to avert it coming true. Okay, thank you very much.
for having us. This is so cool. I'm so happy to be here. And thank you, Uma, for those. I love those pieces. I'm going to read a very short passage from the novel, and I guess all you need to know about it before I get into the scene is that the poor first-person narrator has just been pining for this woman, like up until this is where it's like page 250. So all of these pages before, she's like, and then this is finally the scene of the quote-unquote consummation. And I like to read it because I get to do a porn star voice, and so I do hope you will laugh when I do this voice. Don't leave me doing it alone, you know what I'm saying? Pentimento. To modify a painting by applying a very thin coat of opaque paint to give a duller effect. Hannah appears in the doorway of my bedroom. She is nude, holding a bundle of rope. I'm going to need you to help with the ropes, she says. I wonder where she got those ropes, if she brought them with her from California. Maybe she planned this. She'd thought of our future together. There's an odor to her nakedness. My head swims with it. She wraps the rope around her body, through her legs, down her back, around her stomach, between and around her breasts, over her shoulders, making knots and doubling back, asking me to hold this or that piece, pull on this or that end, holding a piece with her teeth while she stretches another, until she is encased in a web of it, all knots and windows, tight against her skin. As I pull on them, the ropes lance her skin with red welts, and her body looks like how I'd made it look in the Eliza battle. But had I done it myself, or had she been telling me what to do from the beginning? Here she is in front of me. Hannah this. Hannah now. She raises her arms to collect her hair and holds it in a mass atop her head. Then she slides a black leather mask over her face. It has small circles of mesh for eye holes and is split by a large gold zipper with shiny teeth that are grotesque in their size, a toothy grin vertically slicing her head in two. Around the head and ears of the mask are more zippers crisscrossing the head into patches, like pieces of the bones of the skull. I stare into the mask, smell its strong scent of skin, then let my eyes fall over her body woven into its net. I think of fish dragged up from the sea, big animals yoked by ropes and diminished by whips. I don't know what to do next. Her voice comes out of the mask, but the mask doesn't move. Where's the camera? She says. Right, the camera. I stumble to get it. I am clumsy. I am not the one with authority. I look through the eyepiece of the camera and see her in its frame. It looks good, vivid. It's more than just sex and leather, I think, but meaningfully about power and pain and thirst, the debt of want. I know her then all at once, her right to exist, the bright white light shining from her. She is someone who we look at, black and white, and in this looking we are taught how some of us, but not all, can dare to be. As much as a self can be bought, it can also be stolen. Meaning is slippery. Whatever you want it to be, it's whatever. She positions herself around the room and I take photo after photo. She directs me with short commands. Over here, now here. Make this one a portrait. I say nothing. I kneel. Stand over her, lie on my belly, on my back beneath her. She turns away, back to me, bends over, leans on the wall, lies on the floor, on the bed, on her hands and knees. Our choreography is finally in sync. She tells me to sit on the bed. I sit on the bed. She comes close to me, looking down into the camera. The black mask is a hole. She lifts her legs and straddles me, one leg on either side, like Zanat did. "Do you like me like this, Daddy?" she says, and her voice is different. It squeaks. Now she's making a whimpering sound. "Is this what you want, Daddy?" she says. I snap the shutter quickly in a fluster. Is this the kink she was talking about? Really? "Daddy, I want you to like me." She's squeaking again. Her voice is cloying, and it sounds like every straight porn star I've ever seen. She arches her back, and now she's wiggling her ass. "Daddy, Daddy." I am snapped out of the scene, and I see us from across the room. Her little shimmies atop my flat body. "Daddy, Daddy." Oh, so she is just a straight white girl. "You don't like me, Daddy? Have I been a bad girl? Daddy, did I do bad?" I understand now. I am repelled by how ordinary it feels, how ordinary it reveals her to be, and she has dared me to want this. Yes, I managed to say, "You're very bad." This seems to thrill her, and she wriggles faster on top of me. There's the sharp smell of her BO, which makes me scrunch my face. "Daddy, you need to punish me, don't you? I did bad." "Yes," I say, "you did bad. You're the one who hurt me the most." Then she stops wriggling and sits up straight. She starts to tug at the zippers on the mask around the head and pull pieces of hair out of the newly opened holes. Her head is now the head of a doll, the kind that belongs to a violent child who has cut chunks of hair away. And she reaches over me to the nightstand. "Here, use this," she says, and her normal voice is back, flat and hard. She is pushing something into my hand, and I see that it's a lighter. "What?" I say. "Use it to burn my hair," she snaps, and all the simpering is drained out. "And get the shot when the flames are tall." She pulls more hair out of the holes in the mask. "You want me to burn your hair?" Maybe I was wrong. "Then I'll look like you," she says, and starts making a grunting noise through the mask. I understand that she's laughing. I hear in it a pure and cutting sound of contempt. She is tricky and strange and changing, and I am mislaid. Did she simper for me? Is that what she thinks I want? I put the camera down and feel an appalling confusion. Maybe I don't know her or myself or anyone. I fumble with the lighter and drop it. "Come on, you're ruining it." Her voice is harder. She reaches over with an irked swiftness, pushes the lighter into my hand. I feel that my palms are wet with sweat. The lighter is cold and heavy. She wraps her sticky hot fingers around mine and clicks the lighter on. Still holding my hand, she guides the flame to the ends of her hair. "Get the camera ready. Don't miss the shot. Come on, look at me." She taps her hand on my face. I can't remember if it was my forehead or my nose or my cheek, but I remember she taps it hard enough to be a slap. Yes, it was actually a slap. There was a viciousness to it that I tried to forget. Like my mother. Like the woman on the street. Like who I was with Leah. And then she says, "This is my fantasy, not yours. But as I am telling this story now, I want to change the word fantasy to art because it sounds better, gives her more." What do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I was just thinking because like this, I've been reading the book and obviously I've read this section and it's very different hearing you do it because you do the voice so well. But I have so many things. But one of the things I want to talk to you about is muse abuse.
Yes.
Let's talk about muse abuse.
Muse abuse.
Muse abuse. The bad things that happen to muses, because bad things happen to muses quite a lot, and they happen a lot in this book.
Yes.
It felt like there's a sense of like the muse is often kind of like devoured and like burnt up, and I mean, so that I'm really bad with the names of the characters, but the whole thing with the party with the first dog, the party with the first dog, and the discovery that what was maybe framed as like a muse and like artist relationship is actually a kind of consumption and like drawing of energy, and not a kind of mutually supportive or reciprocal kind of thing. And what do you think about muse abuse?
What do I think about it? Yeah, muse abuse. I love that to start because that was kind of for a long time when I was working on the kind of first draft of the manuscript. That was sort of the conceptual framework at the beginning was really to think about the muse as a figure, as a trope, as an archetype, as something that kind of has currency in art. Sort of what is allowed in terms of different behavior, different symbolism when you evoke the muse as the reason for something like that you've made. I think another way to say this, another way to say this might be interesting as context, which was when I started writing the book in 2014. My little sort of elevator pitch to myself was, I thought it would be interesting to start with a character who on paper, in sort of like very basic identity demographics, would be the same as me. So like Korean father, white mother, very white passing, born and raised in LA, poor as dirt, queer as fuck, really into kink, went to art school and now has a lot of debt, and like is trying to like be somebody. But then at every sort of situation or sort of intersection or threshold or, moment in her life where she has to make an important choice, I wanted her to do the thing that I disagreed with or thought was wrong or was ethically, I had a problem with ethically. Or in some of the cases, like kind of less dramatically, just something that I didn't do in that same situation. And so there might be an answer here about how the muse abuse in this book is me, abusing myself as a muse. Because I just really tried to put this character into the like, just everything, I'm like, don't do that, girl. Like, no, like that's the wrong idea. Stop it. Don't do that. No. And then that was the feeling that I kind of just wanted to keep pushing into the entire time I was writing it. To just sort of really just go with somebody who is clearly stumbling and failing and making mistakes. And the reason that she's doing all of that on some level is because she just wants too much. Like it's her desire is the thing that's making her kind of monstrous. And so that I think is another element here of the muse, right? Is like there's a desire relationship with a muse always. Either we want something that we can't have, or we want something that's unattainable, or in a lot of other ways with muses, we want something that we feel like we want to be, like we want to be like, or like you know, it's not necessarily a possessing, it's more of like an identification or a resonance. So there's something about this too.
Yeah, I mean, there's different kinds, isn't there? I guess because there's the idea of the muse, that is how it's presented. That's like the ethical framing of like, this person is inspiration to me, and I'm valuing them highly, and they're just such a beautiful thing in the world for me that I can kind of take build my art from that. But there's also that thing of like, this is the devouring thing of like forcing something onto them in order to then see how it works. And there's a sense in this of that of like characters not just drawing inspiration, but like molding someone else into a thing, which is what you're doing, isn't it? I mean, so literally how the novel works, isn't it? You're forming this person, and you're like driving them out into the world to watch terrible things happen to them, and no judgment, but I just think it's just such an interesting thing to like bring to the surface, because it felt like it was a thing in like discourse around art for ages. We have so many of these like generally cis pairings. We have like Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. We have Erna Kazan and Hans Bellmer, and we have lots of these kind of like dynamics where there is the one who is like crushed and damaged, and at the point of like furthering the other one's career. And it's kind of, I don't know, like in 2023, it feels like a really interesting thing to revisit and look at, and has like a different resonance in light of many things. And you talked about, this is the consummation, the near consummation scene, and it is like right at the edge of this, like, where is the line of the abusive dynamic? Where does it happen? Is it the ick? Is it the point of like the spell is broken and this isn't working anymore? I don't know. I just think it's really interesting to look at the moment, and I don't really have anything else other than I noticed muse abuse, and I thought it was fascinating.
It's definitely muse abuse. I think, I agree, and I think what I wanted to write about on some level was power. I wanted to write about like art and the art world and the sort of exploitative, predatory shenanigans that go on in the art world under the name of art, for art's sake. But quickly that meant I got into things like power. When you're talking about the political, you're talking about power. Who has it, who doesn't, and why? And I feel like the art world is a really socially violent place where power dynamics are always sort of happening all the time in a way that can really feel like shit, to be frank. I mean, it's just sort of awful. And as we were we've known each other for a long time. We sort of always, I feel like, friends, that I know who are also working in the art world in this sort of non-commercial way, like we are. We're often trading like tips and strategies for how to wrestle a tiny little bit of power back from, some institution via email. It's like real abject. It does not feel good. And I think at some point over these years, I've started to try to find, this is what I love about kink, is like you can take dynamics that outside of kink would really feel awful. They would feel unequal. They would feel full of degradation, humiliation, abject, etc. But when they're contained in kink and there's a concept about the ritual and the communication and the consent of them, they can really change this feeling of power, in fact. And so I kind of like, one of the things about writing the book was to try to just think if I could put kink in every scene. Even when she's talking to a gallerist or something, like how could this be a kink scene? I often think this, I think I told you this, like I wish I had a dental kink because I have all these problems with my teeth and it's really a torture to go there. And I'm like, oh God, like if I just like could get into this somehow, it would go easier for me. But I don't have that kink, that particular one, and I wish I did. But it's like in these moments where I'm like, maybe there could be a way where I'm in this email exchange with a curator that feels awful, that I could get into it somehow. Like, ooh, you know,
And you're like,
where is it?
drag this out.
Yeah,
drag this
something.
out, please. Like, misunderstand me.
Like, ooh, now she wants me to click in this Google Doc. Ooh, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, that's sort of where what I think about in some of these situations is like, I mean, obviously I know how awful it feels, you know, to be in social situations, economic situations where there's a gross power imbalance, where I don't have any and, you know, somebody has more than I do, and that's just sort of the way it's going to be. And so I don't know, like that seemed to be like one of the strategies that might, you know, I wanted to give it a try in life, but also just sort of using fiction to test some things out, you know,
Yeah.
world building.
Yeah, so one of the other things I was thinking about that runs through it is the idea of like the double. And obviously there's the big double, which is your protagonist. You're like mirrored, like uncannily on some surface. I think you said like on a DMV check would be the same. But it's something else underneath. And that idea of the double running through it is something I keep thinking about as I've been reading it, and how often in so like in folklore, the idea of like a changeling, your baby is taken away in the night and is replaced by the fairies, and the baby they leave you is on the surface a baby, and it looks like it's crying, you know, or it's sleeping and it's fine. But then after a while, like this kind of glamour on the surface falls away, and inside you realize it's just like rotten straw, or it's like a turnip or something like that. And that idea of like the kind of double as this thing that's just surface seems like particularly relevant for the kind of like art world stuff that you're talking about, which is very not only like the idea of the objects being like on the surface, but the kind of the performance of existence of like, and that folds back into like power and to like class and stuff like that, to be in that like, to have that level of confidence that you can kind of perform the kind of like the kind of trashness and stuff, and that's totally fine. And like, yeah, I just the double is a thing that I keep kind of examining in it, and I don't know what I feel about it, other than like it's I guess it's one of those things that you've told me before about the what is your wonderful description of like the meaning about the, like you understand what's going on, but your audience will understand what's going on, but they will not necessarily be able to grasp like kind of like, you know, what things are underneath. And that feels a bit like that idea of the double, that you kind of understand what it's doing, but then there's something underneath that's like unsettling, and that feels like a really interesting aspect of how we think about art and stuff.
Yeah. I love the double. I mean, I love, yeah, a lot of this, the kind of strategies and stuff in the book are just taken, you know, really blatantly from like Gothic horror and certain kinds of noir tropes, especially. But I have something to say about this. Like, I'm afraid I might pontificate a minute about this idea of the surface versus, say, a depth. I think one of the things that a novel does well, because I really thought about that for most of, I mean, it took me 9 years to do this thing, so I really had to think about it a lot. Like, what am I doing? Why write a novel, especially now, and especially try to make like a kind of real one? That was the joke. It's like, oh, I'm going to try to write a real novel. Like, what's that? I think that one of the more interesting things that I heard when I was thinking about what a novel even is was from a friend of mine who said, you know, the thing that's sort of specific to a novel that other forms don't have as much is this element of time, that it takes a long time to write a novel and it takes a long time to read a novel. And these are not the same amount of time for the writer and the reader, but they're kind of closer than other forms in the sense of, it could take me months, years to paint a painting or to write a record, but experience it as an audience member can go by pretty fast, in the sense that like there's a kind of different amount of time spent. With a novel, like the feeling I have as a writer writing one is similar to a reader reading one. You're still kind of going through this world. There's a sort of interiority to novels that no other form really does. You read them alone, you read them in silence, or you have one voice talking to you, reading it out loud. There's this sort of interiority to it where you can really kind of live in there over time. And what that does, I think, in terms of storytelling, is you get to have this kind of feeling of the character's interiority, what their intentions are, what they're thinking about, go out and have consequence in the world of the novel. And I think that this distance between the interiority of the character and then how the reader sees the consequence, I think that's where the novel is interesting, how vast that distance is. Another way to say this is I feel like everyone can kind of relate to the feeling of like that on the inside you're a certain way and on the outside people read you, and that might not always line up, right? Like that how people see you on the outside is not necessarily how you are on the inside. This feeling of a distance between the inside and the outside, I think, is especially true in political terms, right? Like, I am someone, for example, who doesn't look like what I am. So, like, I look like a white cis woman who's able-bodied. But what I am is a Korean American disabled genderqueer person. And so there's this big distance between like what I know myself to be, almost as if it's an ontology, to how that is like interpreted, seen, the surface, right, that is sort of out there in the world without me on the other side of my face, and it means something else depending on who and what is doing the interpretation. So there's something about this kind of thing of the surface and the relationship to a depth that I find very interesting. The other thing I can say about it is this Jasper Puar idea that was in Terrorist Assemblages, where she said sort of what happened in the wake of 9/11 was this slip between the visual into the affective into the ontological. Somebody looked like a terrorist, which meant they seemed like a terrorist, which meant they were a terrorist. This kind of, from the visual you look like something into that's what you are. And I feel like this is a conundrum that just felt like it was really interesting to deal with in the context of the art world. Also to make her a painter. Because a painting is an interesting example of this. Like it's a 2D surface, but it's a whole world in there, that's like kind of unto itself, and it kind of radiates its beingness on some level. And then there's this other thing about the double, is that it looks like it seems like it, but is it really it? This kind of question, which I find to be like, I don't know. What do you think about the authentic ontology of the beingness?
I mean, okay,
Uma?
So I think the line from the bit from A Terrorist Assemblages, which is a book I really like, and I think there's part of this is it's like a flattening of options, isn't it? So things that are like the openness of like affect, of like this is a thing before language that could mean all kinds of things, to something that becomes like a visual thing which is open to different interpretations, to a thing that is fixed and exists and like is definite. And this is a reduction of like meaning down to like what is the loudest thing or the obvious thing that this could mean. I mean, that feels like a kind of particularly relevant cultural thing since 9/11, as things get open to reinterpretation, or not open to interpretation, but either like the worst interpretation of a thing can be grabbed. And we've talked a little bit before about an author that we both really like, which is Gretchen Martin Feltner.
Yes. Manhunt.
Read Manhunt. It's really upsetting.
So great.
But there's something that I really like about Manhunt, and I've said this before, is that it's a unapologetic book by a trans woman who writes about the kind of stuff that respectability politics would say that trans women are not allowed to write about. It's an incredibly violent, pulpy, a post-apocalyptic novel. It's full of things that are on the surface like superficial and glib, while at the same time being actually treated with like real sincerity. And it's a thing that would raise I don't want to say raise red flags, but it's not really the right thing. It writes bad headlines really easily. It's a thing that like it's like bait for the Daily Mail and anything that can pull out anything, because it's just it deals with stuff that is meant to be steered clear of, because the author's identity renders it a thing that's like open to all kinds of like, this is, you know, this is like misogynistic violence, or this is a thing that's like that knife edge between a parody of femininity or not feminine enough. And that, yeah, so that line from Jasbir Kaur that you mentioned, that kind of feels like that really nails down that like limiting of like what people are allowed to do. That one, what I said before, is like kind of the bad faith moralizing that, you know, that says that I will pick the worst interpretation. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. First of all, I was just like texting Uma, like, because I'm reading Manhunt right now, so don't spoil it. I'm not at the end. But I'm just sort of, I was saying, I just have to stare out the window for long periods of time after particular paragraphs and scenes in this novel. It's so good. It's such a great book. But it's really like, it's just gutting me, you know, like I just kind of have to be like after, at the end of each chapter. I love it so much. I think there's some part of me, like, here I'm going to say something, another pontificatory, I'm like not into Plato. Which means that like this idea that there's the pure Platonic ideal that it doesn't exist on this earthly plane, right? That's the idea of Plato. That's Plato's whole thing. That's where we get the word Platonic. That it's this perfect ideal form of a thing. Each thing, like this cup, exists on a Platonic realm that's not this one, you know, but it's like the one pure thing. I hate this idea. I don't know why exactly. I remember when Johannes and I were first together, my partner and I remember like, I was like, wait a minute, are you a Platonist? I was like pissed. Because the alternative, like if we're doing this kind of, I'm sorry to be philosophizing at the moment, but like an Aristotelian idea is like there's just a lot of these and they're all like kind of in the world materially and there isn't one pure one. That's the idea. It's kind of like more use value or something. So I kind of worry sometimes about this idea of insisting on an ontology or a beingness that's like the authentic one.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons, like, you know, like a real woman, quote unquote, for example, being one, you know, like a real, like just throw in any, you know, any hot button, you know, possibly incendiary identity politic term in there. Like what's a real fill in the blank X, you know? Yeah. And I think that I feel this way, where I just don't know how useful it is to insist on these things. Also from, you know, the side of it from my own experience of like my experience in identity has been one about slipperiness and passingness primarily. Like I don't really belong or look like I belong anywhere. And that's sort of been true my whole life. And not just about identity stuff, like also in terms of like class or like weirdo things, you know, like I'm a goth, but like I also love Beyonce, you know, like this kind of stuff, like where there's subcultural ways that we indicate or comport ourselves toward a belongingness, you know. And like just to be frank, like, you know, I wrote Sick Woman Theory and I'm always like, am I disabled enough though? Like, am I sick enough to ask the, you know, like the airline, that I need an aisle seat and I need wheelchair service at the airport. Am I sick enough to do that? What if I don't look like it? Like, these sorts of questions are sort of always on my mind.
Are you looking for messiness? Are you looking for a philosophy of like allowing
Yes.
messiness? I think, yeah.
Is it Aristotle?
I don't know, but like, I mean, just like it seems like that's what's needed. I mean, I've noticed like in terms of maybe like writing and like TV, there's the beginning of things like the kind of like messy gay narratives, which aren't really a thing before, because we had the sacrificial kind of like the gays die first in movies, or like bad things happen as punishment, and then we had the opposite of that, of the more like kind of tender queer kind of beautiful utopian things. And I feel like maybe there's some time for like, you know, not the platonic, but a kind of messy reality, and people are to do bad things, make mistakes, attempt to atone for mistakes, and do the hard stuff of like trying to resolve. And like we were talking the other day about your problematic fave of Spike in Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
I'm sorry. I really like Spike.
And maybe
I
he's
have
like
a Spike mouse pad.
and weirdly, and like, yeah, like that's like it's still a, not, I wouldn't say it's a unique narrative, but it's a very rare narrative to have a redemption arc, because normally what happens, as with like disabled characters or characters that are rendered disabled in a narrative, the narrative wants to quickly move on, so they're just killed. And to have a thing of like someone making a mistake and being pulled and supported and something, you know, to atone, it's like uncomfortable.
Yeah, I was talking about Spike the other day with Uma, because there's a scene in here where you watch the protagonist really go too far. It's a rape scene where, you know, she like gets really far into it, and then she's like, wait a minute, what am I doing? And then she tries to pull back, but she doesn't know how. And this scene was incredibly important to me to have. I really thought it was like the point to really push a reader into thinking about ethics. Like, what do we do with people who fuck up? Like, what do we do? I know we're talking all the time about care and inclusivity and all of these things. And then, you know, in my experience of social justice and kind of working in activism, because when I was working on this book, I had a day job in activism for 8 years. And, you know, the horizon seemed to just be that we all had to feel good all the time about each other and agree. And then the minute we did not agree, or there was conflict, or somebody said something, you know, wrong or problematic at the meeting, just disaster. It just fell apart. You know, it just completely fell apart. We didn't know how to actually like kind of wade into this mucky part. Like, what if sometimes like people suck? Do you still have to care for them? You know, like, and the answer is yes, of course. But how do you do that? You know? And so I was saying what I appreciated about this, no spoilers, but in Buffy the Vampire Slayer season 6, they take this beloved crowd favorite character and they make him, you know, do like, you know, the most horrific thing, where he attempts to rape Buffy, and then in the moment he realizes what he's doing, and then he's like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And he's ashamed and, you know, runs away. And what I thought was interesting about this as a turn was that they spend all of season 7 trying to figure out what to do with him. And I just realized I had never seen a show or, you know, a movie try to do that. Because, like, the gang is like, well, what are we going to do with him? Like, we can't just, like, leave him out there in exile. Like, what do we do? And I feel like these are questions that I'm thinking about a lot with like prison abolition, you know, reparative and restorative justice, like these sorts of things. It's like, yeah, what do we do when people fuck up?
Yeah.
For whatever reason, you know, and this is the other thing we were talking about, kind of another strain of thinking about care is I've been running into, I've been trying to write about addiction in my new book. The book next year that comes out is the collection of essays with like sick woman theory in it and all of my thinking around care and disability. And so I realized at some point I had to include addiction as something to think about with like care. And I have just been encountering in the last few months while I've been writing it, like a lot of CRIP friends, like disability justice people, really kind of having a different approach to care when it's necessitated by addiction than like an illness. And I just found that really odd. I was like, why? Isn't it just people need help, and that's it doesn't matter why. You should care for them.
Yeah, it's like this moral value ascribed to a problem. And I was saying, yeah, like it's the same line as saying, you know, some people are responsible for themselves. It's like, well, if you couldn't afford to raise a child while you have a child, kind of thing. It's like the same kind of it's that same kind of mentality of saying, well, you've made this mistake, it's your fault. There are certain situations that we find ourselves in that we are blameless for, and therefore they are the good kind.
Right.
And then there are the ones that we feel like we have some kind, that other people feel we have some kind of agency in our own undoing. But like, yeah, why are those things split?
Could you maybe talk a little bit? I mean, I think that horror as a genre is such a, like, why I love it is because this sort of messiness we're talking about, people fucking up, things being horrifying, you know, people doing the wrong, bad thing. Like, this is what the genre really, you know, is sort of made of. But can you just sort of give us
of people making mistakes, like in horror film?
I just think, like I don't know. I just want Dr. Breakdown to talk about horror for a minute as a genre.
I mean, I feel like what happens in a lot of horror films is mistakes are punished, and arguably a lot of horror is about mistakes or transgressions, social transgressions. You know, oh no, you guys had sex, now you're going to get killed. That's the thing, that these are society's moral positions writ large with a knife. And so, but there's not really much like forgiveness in that. And if anything, you get things like the rape revenge structure, which is you get an audience that gets to marvel in the spectacle of something horrendous happening and are validated in the third reel when that person gets revenge, and those people who they'd previously watched like with this like lurid look on the lens as it like watch this thing happen, get their comeuppance, and then you're validated. So you get this like as an audience like trip into something disgusting. But in terms of like mistakes and stuff, so I keep coming back to my fledgling Letterboxd list, which I call...
We're now on Letterboxd, by the way. We're very excited about it.
Hidden secretly on Letterboxd. And I'm really interested in police procedurals. Like, I love cop shows. I'm not a particular supporter of police, but I'm very much into the forensic, the model, and it's the thing that I've been watching watching my whole life. And we're talking about Memories of Murder, and what I really
Memories
like
of
about
Murder. It's by Bong Joon-ho. It's early Bong Joon-ho.
Yeah, it's like it's a cop show where the cops don't get the killer, and the thing peters out at the end. And I really love this, like an ending that lacks that moral, like in the end you will be caught. The end, justice will prevail, but actually becomes like it's the ending to, sorry to spoil this movie from like 15 years ago. The policeman quits. And he's doing something else, like in the future. The memories he's thinking about is like the last case he worked, and he couldn't resolve it. And that thing is like, as a general thing, like plots where the mistake is never resolved is something that I'm just like absolutely fascinated with. A thing that somehow still satisfies as a piece of art without doing the thing that probably everyone who does film school or like writes a narrative or writes a novel is told they have to do, like resolve this point in the beginning,
Yeah.
And that I'm just like, maybe I'm just contrary, but I really love it.
No, I feel the same way. Like, my joke with writing this real novel is that I spent 9 years Googling what is a plot, and I still don't know. But the other day, my friend was saying, he gave me a great definition of plot. He said, plot is what's there when there's nothing else. Because I think, like, I actually had like a little kind of, to be contrary, I had a little contrariness going on in this book where anytime there was like a thing, this is what I was saying about, I never wanted my reader to be confused about what was happening, but I did want them to be confused about what it meant in the like kind of moral universe of the book. And so what that kind of translated to on the page on a craft level is that anytime I had a scene, or a particular character or a symbol or a theme or something feel kind of consolidated, I then wrote a twin scene or with a character where it was slightly tweaked or inverted or something about it happened the same but different. And there was a kind of system. We can talk about systems also.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I was sort of doing in trying to write a real novel, since I didn't know what the fuck that meant, is I just used a lot of systems. One was that I read that in a real novel, in a story, you have to have 3 battle scenes. And the first 2, your character loses, and the last one, they win. So I thought it would be fun to have my 3 battle scenes be sex scenes, and then also art openings. Like, just to think, like, how can you win or lose one of these? 'Cause
Everyone
you certainly
loses.
can. Yeah.
I've never won an art opening in my
No,
life.
I mean that was like kind of also fun because I think they sort of happen. They're usually like the sex is after the art opening, and it goes like horribly wrong or whatever. But there was something about this idea of having 3 where there would be a twinning and then a third one that was kind of this other triangulation of the twins. I think the third space is maybe I'm dating myself, but I remember like being in grad school and taking a class where it was like, it doesn't have to be a binary. There can be 3. And I was like, holy shit, like, wow. So that was kind of happening in this sort of way. But I think the other thing about trying to do that is that I really wanted to resist this thing of the causality in a plot, where something happens because something else happened before it. That's our understanding of plot. If you read like How to Write a Real Novel books, they say that. Like you have to have this sort of chain of causality with what's going on. And always my favorite kinds of stories don't have that. There's some moment where it goes off the rail, where the policeman who for the entire movie is doggedly trying to solve this case, and then at the end it just cuts to like 15 years later he's not a policeman anymore, and now he's in insurance, and that's it. And you don't really have this sort of comfortable causality to think about. But
Yeah.
I think also, like, just to maybe say something about your show upstairs, which is going to open soon and everybody should come back and see it. It's so cool. But there's something about like visual art being in a room with a lot of different objects that I think does something fun to causality. Because I was saying what's cool about Uma's show is that they've been there making some of the work in the room and installing like a lot of time spent in that room. And you can always tell when an artist has been in the room, like, and put the work exactly where it is and thought about the lighting and kind of moved things around rather than just shipping something to be put up somewhere. You can really feel it. And there's something about that kind of causality that I really like, where you can kind of feel like a hand put it somewhere very specific on the thing. I don't know. I'm just thinking about different ways that a story can be told.
Yeah, I mean, no, well, first of all, thank you. But the causality is like so strange in an exhibition because it's not a form that is as linear. I don't want to say that like a book is linear because obviously while you're reading it, you're still thinking about all the bits back. If anything, it's like kind of like a backstitch. As each time you move forward, you're like reconfiguring all the things before. But like it has a direction mostly. And like an exhibition, you are maybe like, or even like looking at a painting, you are like drawn to some bits and you keep trying to contextualize them or to understand them through looking at the other things. So I can look at the bright bits that catch my eye, and then I'm starting to make sense of them through the darker bits and stuff like that. And yeah, like why that isn't a thing that can be addressed more in a novel or in a film, without, while still, being this like medium that travels forwards. And I think some of that is the idea of like putting stuff in that is like troubling and is quote unquote kind of like bad writing. That rule of cinema that like everything has to advance the plot. Like if your scene is not doing that, then you need to remove it. But then loads of films have these like wonderful kind of bits that do something else. So maybe they do something about like a mood, or they set like a kind of feeling. And like you notice it if you watch kind of new Hollywood era kind of films. You watch something let's say like Dog Day Afternoon or something like that. There will be like shots that kind of feel like, well, this is longer than it would be now. And I really like that, because my thing in art is that I want to be like, I want to be shown kind of things, but I also want to be shown like ways in which I might do something with them, and I want to be given space to do that. And I think that's the really interesting thing. It's just it is technically bad writing, but it's really fun. I mean, rules. The rules of breaking novels are as old as novels. Like Moby Dick is just an absolute nuts.
Bonkers.
Yeah, like Moby Dick, like Tristram Shandy, or like one of my favourite things is The King in Yellow, which is a collection of short stories, which is barely coherent as a thing, but like absolutely evocative as a kind of description of a world.
Yeah. I feel like we should take questions in 1 second, but the last thing I want to say is, do you want to talk just briefly about violence?
Oh yeah, let's talk about violence.
This is all we had prepared to talk about.
Our notes for this were violence. I really struggle with violence, and it's probably evident from my thing. It's from my reading that like I keep trying to write things about violence because I'm fascinated with it. I'm fascinated with the idea of like kinetics, of like descriptions of movement, of feelings of like affective stuff, of like crunches and like all kinds. Like I just find it like fascinating the way that we'll talk about wrestling maybe later, but like that. And I find it really hard. So I always descend into the kind of like the horror of something like The Evil Dead, which is always, it's slapstick. It's funny at the same time. Yeah. I find it really hard. I could never write the horror of Manhunt. I could never write the violence of Manhunt because I could not take myself seriously enough to do it. Can you write violence?
I would love to write more violence. I mean, I this was also something I was so impressed by in this novel Manhunt that we're talking about by Gretchen Felker Martin, is that the action sequences where it's like they're kind of running through the woods and one has a bow and arrow and they're being shot at with guns and it's this very kind of choreographed action sequences, and I love action movies.
It's like it's the description of the kind of events. So it's really it's not the kind of broad thing of like people, it is people running through the woods being shot with bows and arrows, but it's also very close. It's like what the arrow did.
Yeah.
And in that, it has that.
Unzipped her cheek. That's one of the phrases.
Specific, and then it will come back to like what it is like to have that, and like the dealing of like to clean the wound and stuff.
Yeah.
And in that, it reminds me actually one of, I don't know if it's a problematic fave, but like Cormac McCarthy, because these books are like,
is it problematic?
I don't know, I just assume. These books are like, because they're like technical descriptions, and he's someone that like absolutely loves technical description of stuff. In I think it's All the Pretty Horses, there's an entire chapter devoted to how to use a rope in order to secure a wolf, and it involves long descriptions of how the rope will be attached to the wolf, how it will be snared, how the rope will be pulled over a branch so that the wolf can be pulled out of reach and then tied further and stuff like that. And it's just full of this like technical description of like physical stuff, often with this like violent kinetic motion of like things at the edge of breaking and stuff like that. And that's the thing that I find that I really enjoyed in Manhunt, was the same kind of like nerdy, like drilling down into a description, like a manual in some ways of like how this thing is taken apart, but it happens to be it's a body.
Yeah, I love that too. I love that stuff. I'm like a huge fan of the UFC. I'm not even being ironic about it. I watch it every week. I'm like, I
Which
really
is also like
love
very
it.
technical, isn't it? Because it's
Oh,
broken
it's so
down into like
beautiful.
everything got a name, and
Yeah.
like the delivery of a thing has got
Yes.
like a kind of a quality attached to it.
Yeah, I love it. And I guess like, maybe to try to tie it back into the book in a really obvious way, but there, in this scene that I'm talking about, that where we have the sexual assault that kind of like, pushes the reader into really feeling uncomfortable about this protagonist that we've followed for so long. There was something about this that I was really interested in having also, where there's a lot of other sex in the book, a lot of other sex, a lot of other really kinky sex. She goes to a dominatrix also. But there's something about this scene where, because the other person is like not consenting to it, they consent to it and then they don't. And they're like, yes, I'm into this. No, I'm not into it anymore. And this moment where there's this kind of like having to negotiate this is where everything gets really icky. And I think that I wanted to have something like this sort of violence where clearly the protagonist is doing violence. But the whole novel is sort of saturated with this kind of violence that's consented to and not consented to, and where these kinds of lines shift are these places where I wanted to linger, like in these sort of icky gray, like it's not all the way there yet, but it's going that way, and now this sort of like place where things shift. And I can say, to sort of go back to the very beginning when I said like this is a character where I had her do things that I disagreed with. Like for many years I worked as a dom, and I have to say, I mean, a lot of the time I would just be doing violence to these people, but that's what they were paying me to do. That's what they asked me to do. And it was either physical violence or like psychological humiliation kind of violence, where I'd be telling them, you're so ugly or whatever. I'm very good at this. And that was kind of weird. I was in my 20s when I was doing it, and it was weird to notice that. Like I just kind of signed up with an agency, and I kind of learned like, oh, I'm particularly good at this one thing. Like this is sort of the specialty that I'm like really good at. And that was interesting and kind of scary to realize. And I was saying this to you that, being socialized as a woman means that even though there's this universal language of violence being spoken to you all the time and being inflicted on you all the time, you are taught that you should never speak it back. Like it's very like you're not supposed to speak it back as a woman, being socialized as a woman. And I think that something happened for me, I guess, in my like understanding of gender and queerness, but just also just other ways of negotiating power in the political or social space, that had to do with thinking about violence as not just this thing that could happen to me against my will, but something that I could do with other people consensually, with a kind of ritual and respect around it. This is what I like about the UFC. It's what I like about watching boxing and MMA and wrestling. One of the things I love about it is because with these sort of fights, there will be damage that will happen. You necessarily fold care into the event. So it's as important what happens in the corner between each round, with the fighter going to their corner and their team is there and they're like getting the ice and the water and the, cheerleading and everything, as what's happening in the rounds where they're actually fighting in the ring. And I find this very interesting. Like we don't really include care in this sort of part of the entertainment in any other that I can think of, any other kind of like sporting event or movie or something like this, where the care is actually as important as the fighting. And I feel like I just am curious, like what would happen if the care was included in some of these some of these different
Well,
contexts.
it's similar to the spike thing in that there's like the reparative bit is folded in as part of the experience rather than just being said to happen off screen or to not happen. And like, yeah, what that would mean, it would mean, yeah, it's like the messy, the pain bit.
Well,
it's like it's after the adrenaline.
And I think like the thing that's really uncomfortable to think about with this on the left, right, is what that means about care is that kind of pain and damage have to be there too. I think, thinking about care as being necessitated by pain is a really tricky relationship to think about. It's like, oh, you mean we have to have the pain? Like it has to be there. And it's like, yes, it does. It actually, the other way of saying that is like, if we could just, go forward in life and together in this society and not have pain, that would be great. But pain is going to be there. It's always going to be there. And so how do we kind of dream our political dreams of the future, including that? Yeah.
I might start just following up from that thing that you were just talking about in terms of pain and care. And earlier you mentioned at art school being like, hey, there's this third way. And I guess I'm sort of trying to think through, how do you break beyond the kind of this binary position of you need to have both in order for either one to make sense of each other, and what it means also in relation to other kinds of forms of creation. So you also talked about systems, and Uma, I know with your work there's so much that's kind of defined by rules of games and gameplay and world building with those kinds of rules. And when you're creating a world, when you're creating the rules of a world, how do you allow for both these kinds of negative spaces, the reparative actions around them, and maybe something else? And is that something else also where that world building and creativity kind of comes in?
I'm going to answer first because I've got the microphone. Okay, thank you. So I'm really fascinated by systems, and I use systems in everything I do, and I kind of joke, kind of not really actually being serious, that it's a way of like dealing with my kind of lack of executive function on things. That like if I have a system to follow, that's one thing I don't have to worry about. If there's a rule that every time something is placed on the floor, it needs to be placed on something else before it's on the floor, that trims the field of like what I actually have to think about and puts other things in. The other side of it is that systems have like a breaking point at some point in the future, and that's the thing that I find really exciting, because I know what will happen if we set the rules in place that will do this for the bit that I can see. Like writing a story, and often if I'm doing like stories or something, I'll have like a system that's something like every line has to be every paragraph has to be exactly 4 lines and have to be tight, justified across the whole thing. This will eventually start causing real problems with how things work, and that's where I find it really exciting, because it's just causing damage later on, and that's when the thing becomes like a collaborative project between me and whatever rules me in the past set, and that I have to deal with that. But it's the damage that I find really interesting, like the thing where the system can't be sustained, it kind of goes off orbit and it crashes into something else. So that's why I like it in games. And kind of, like in any kind of like art production, is mistakes and problems.
I love that. I think that's a great question too. What's the third thing that would like kind of be an interesting thing to add to pain and care? The thing that comes to mind, this might not be a good answer, but is humor. I think humor, camp, being able to laugh in the face of disaster, it can kind of like disrupt both pain and care. The problem that I have a lot of the time with care is that it's just so earnest. And it just kind of gets into this infantilized, are you okay? Thing that's actually like, this is something that I feel, just sort of in over the years of working with institutions who are really like, trying to do things for disability access and really going, like we want to learn, we want to change. And often what it boils down to is me being treated like a child when I arrive. Like, honestly, I just sort of show up and they're like, okay, and rather than me being like, I have, like, for example, when I play music, a lot of the time when I arrive at a venue, I just need to sound check. I need to make sure the lights work. I need to make sure the sound in the room is good. And I have literally shown up at venues where they're like, okay, we're going to all like sit in a circle and check in about our feelings first. And I'm like, I don't need that. I need to check the lights and the sound, and we're on a timer. I need to like do my actual like work. So this is the thing I think that like the labor of care, I think, is still in the Pinterest board stage of like the sort of maternal pastel colors kind of vibe, where, for me, like I can just say some of the contexts and places that I felt the most cared for have been like in the mosh pit of a hardcore show where everyone is like helping each other out, or like there in a way to like make sure that, yeah, there might be like damage or pain that happens in these moments, but like, hey, we're all there together. And there's a kind of like, yeah, like in those kind of moments of rupture or damage or something, there's something else that happens that's not as heavy. It's like kind of lighter or something. I don't know. Like that's the thing that comes to mind is like humor or some kind of wit or joke or something to kind of take it out of. Is that's the problem with care? Is it's a drag.
There's like, sorry. There's like a kind of joy that extends across all of these things, and even like terrible kind of situations. There's that thing that, and I guess maybe I'm using the same word, maybe using a different word for the same thing, of like the humor, but that joy of like, this thing has gone wrong, but there are people here that will look after me and we'll fix it. And also it's kind of amazing how it went wrong. And yeah, I don't know. Obviously, these things don't necessarily extrapolate across all situations and something like that. And there are different things where that joy will be less present. But it's something different from the things you're describing, which feel like the kind of performance of a thing that means care, rather than the actual nuts and bolts practical thing, which is, line check, is the DI working, stuff like that. Or, whatever, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Hello. So there's a scene early on in the book at an art opening where the artist overhears the work being described as visceral, which is the art world's way of saying that it wasn't produced by a white man. And I just wondered, it's quite a basic question, are there any other sort of buzzwords like that or categories that you find your work, both of you, being put into, and which ones piss you off the most?
Ooh, I love that. Let me think.
Question.
I mean, I can just be very frank. I know we're recording this, but if I am in another show that's got care in the title, I'm gonna kill somebody. Like, honestly. Because care in the art world is such a big moment, and like literally every show I've been in that has care in the title is like been an exploitative, predatory mess where no one got paid, and it was just like all the disabled artists were like, "What is happening?" Like we were all just texting each other, like, "Did you know they put your video in the cafe?" And they're, my friend is like, "It's supposed to be in a black box, like theater." And it's like, well, bitch, it's in the cafe. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I have to say that. Like, if I'm invited to another care show, I think one of mine, like, there's a care show opening, like, next week with my stuff in it. But, yeah, I don't know. It's a kind of a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot. And in the art world, I don't know what it means, because I know what care means in my Crip network. Like, I know what it means when my friend calls me because they need me to come over with groceries. I know what that means, but I don't know what it means when, like, a curator sends me a statement about radical interdependency and queer trust, and then they also, like, don't pay me well. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the same. I think it's just like when words become so flattened that all they mean is like a certain kind of art, and you can't even tell because that certain kind of art just like expands and expands. I don't read press, so I don't know. I don't think of my work. I don't even know what my work is described as.
Oh, I thought of one.
Yeah. What?
Vulnerable. Yeah, I get called vulnerable a lot. I am just like, I don't know. There was like a minute there where like people were like, how can you write about such vulnerable topics?
Oh, I've got one. I've got one. Generous. Generous. I get because I do quite a lot of talks, and it's very often that was really generous, and that is like I think I want to remember to use that because that is the most perfectly barbed insult you could do for anything. Like it's like just like that was something. You know, it's like, yeah, that was really generous of you. It's like you've just shat on the floor. That was really generous of you. Yeah, I think as soon as the thing gets picked up and it just gets opened up, but thank you so much for this healing moment.
Would healing be one of yours as well?
Oh, definitely. I'm always like, get that out of here. Wait, can I?
The reparative is my one. I get that quite a lot.
You get that? Yeah. Reparative.
It's the same.
Yeah, it's the same. Whenever they put healing in my thing, I add the failure of in front of it. And I was thinking about this the other day, that there should be a word for when artists have to rewrite the text that the curator sends them about their own work, where you get it and you're like, oh God, not that. My partner said we should call it whack-a-dacka, because you're like, like a whack-a-mole. Because like I got one the other day that was talking about like the vagina is like birth and creation, and I was like, cut all of this. Like it was really too much. I was like, vagina? Why are you putting this word in your So you have to whack-a-dack it. Anyway, sorry, I'm going to start screaming more.
I want to really state, because I have a show here at Fact, and Matri is sitting right there. The copy has been impeccable. I've not red penned a single word. I've taken notes.
Thank you. So I was really interested in everything that you said about pain and care and messiness, and it seems really relevant at the moment because I'm co-hosting a queer book club, the first of hopefully a series if it goes well, next week, and the first book is In the Dream House. And so holding that space is going to be really difficult, but we're going to try and do it with as much care as possible. And so for those of you that don't know, that it's basically a book that encounters domestic abuse within a queer relationship. And I wondered, when you're writing, or if you were to have your book or either of your texts read within the context of a book club, do you have any recommendations for holding that space?
Like trigger warnings?
Maybe not trigger warnings, but like, are there provocations or anything that you would suggest? Or even, I guess, maybe what would you recommend we read next?
Oh. I loved In the Dream House. I loved that book. I loved Her Body and Other Parties also. One of the reasons I loved it, and I used In the Dream House actually as a reference when I was like fighting for this one scene with my, when we were going on submission, is I was like, it's really important to talk about abuse and sexual assault in queer relationships, because I can just say this, like in my experience, like I've been abused by queer women more than men, actually. So I think it's really missing from the conversation a lot of the time. I mean, I remember when I was younger and I first came out, and I remember thinking like, oh, if I'm just with women, I'll just like not have to deal with patriarchal, misogynistic, sexist violence. Like, great, like I'll just not have to have that. And then, that's not what happens at all. My favorite way of handling like material, like either in a classroom or in a reading group or in any kind of situation, I'm going to take from like the way I saw it handled the best was a friend of mine named Konstantina Zavitsanos, who's an amazing disabled artist and also a professor. And I've kind of appeared in their classes a couple of times, just like visiting as a speaker. And before every class, like Tina's just like, hey, like access is just how we're going to like get together today. So like whatever you need to be here, like we're all going to work on that together. We're all going to like hold the space. And Tina's like, yeah, and trigger warning for everything in this class. We're going to talk about all these things that are really hard to deal with, things that are traumatic, things that are painful, things that are heavy and intense. And we're going to like do it together. And that's how we're going to do it. And like, if you want to leave, you can. If you need something, you can DM me privately. You can talk about it to everybody. Like, just do whatever you need. We're all just going to try to be here together in this space. And I think, like, I don't want to sound like a total sadist because I'm really not, but I do think that being afraid or like kind of like shrinking back from scenes in art that are intense and can like potentially trigger somebody. And I say this as somebody with like literal CPTSD, and I have to like read trigger warnings before I watch any movie or show. There's something about being able to talk about it with other people that is so great. Like, even that there are websites that have trigger warnings for people like me is so great. Like, that I can like look it up, So I feel like I don't think the answer, to questions around like how do we make safe spaces, I don't think it's like to, remove these things or kind of dumb them down, quote unquote, or, dilute them or anesthetize them in some way. I think it's actually to be like, we're going to go through it together, and that'll be like way better than going through it alone. I would say for your queer book club, Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin. I mean, also because she did a great talk with Carmen Maria Machado online, and Gretchen Felker Martin talks about this exact thing. She's like, in like, the right dose, scenes of extreme violence, pain, trauma in art can actually make people more empathetic and open, right? And that's something like on the page, like thinking about it as a craftsperson, you want to go into these topics so that the reader like starts thinking about them rather than like shuts down and flinches away. Like, that's not what you want to do. You want to actually be able to go in there with them. And you can really tell when a writer doesn't give a shit about what when the writer doesn't give a shit about what the reader's going to experience in these horrific scenes. You can tell. And you can tell when a writer's like, let's do it together. We're going to think about this together. And so that's what I would say about that. Is like kind of just translating that into a group dynamic of like, we're all just going to do it together. It'll be all right. Even if, it's hard. Am I being too like sappy?
No, you're being fine. You're still tough. I mean, just to echo that, I think this comes back to the thing you were saying before about the durational thing. And I think when good writing does it, it's not like a jump scare kind of thing that's then left, because that's easy to write, and it's and it throws everything, and it's unpleasant, and the same thing applies, I guess, to the reading group, which is that you can change duration, so change like the speed of the thing. It's like this section is going to need to be slower, and we're going to need to spend like a bit more time on this. And also, I guess in general, the thing that I really enjoy is when any kind of study thing that's dealing with really difficult stuff is like responsive. So it's like, actually, this group at this time needs to do this in this way, because this is actually, we're really feeling this one, and we need a bit more time with it, and we need to maybe go into something else as like a parallel to understand this further. So what's another book or whatever the thing, we'll read a sample bit from something else and talk about how is the violence in this different from the violence in what we're reading, or something like that. But the idea of it being like responsive rather than like bulldozering through. It's like, guys, we've got to hit, 5 5 pages today, otherwise we're not going to keep on track and we're going to lose this room. It has to be, a thing that's like kind of like with his care, isn't it? It's like, actually, I need a little bit more time to, patch this wound.
Yeah. Last one.
Oh, I've got a book recommendation. You should, you should read. Serious Weakness by Porpentine Charity Heartscape. It's really upsetting. Okay.
You're asking like wrong people.
Because that's really upsetting in a way that is really nice.
Hi. I was going to say maybe there's something about that whole idea of messiness and violence and care and the kind of the narratives where the thing doesn't get resolved. That's interesting in relation to maybe the care needs to allow room for violence and messiness, and maybe often like the institutional care diminishes the demand or the need for care because it doesn't have the room in it to be loud and violent and uncomfortable. And maybe this kind of like the assertion of or maybe even something that feels like it's sympathetic and condescending, like just I feel like there's the things are all kind of interlinked, that reaction of like a type of care, and maybe when strangers offer you care, they need to allow for that messiness and violence, and when you talk about care from people that know you, it's a totally different thing. So I just thought it was something.
That's a great point. Thank you for it. It makes me think, I think when we're talking about these ways in which care fails, it's still because it's based on this idea that care is only required sometimes, which is so wrong, and we saw it in the pandemic. It was like, oh, well, we'll just do a little bit, not a lot, and then, it'll be over fast and we'll get back to normal, right? There's still this idea that illness and need and pain are these kind of contingencies that just sort of surprise us, which is fucking bonkers. Like illness, pain, need are the most universalizing conditions. Everybody feels this at some point in their life and experiences this. We've been talking about this. There are obviously different gradations, and that's what makes disability, I think, really, frankly, different in some way, is that there's an actual difference between, like, if I can open that door or not. There's an actual difference between if I can and you can. Like, if I can't, you can, there's a difference there. But the way that we kind of conceptualize care is that, it's still based on this model that disability is this sort of surprise, this like thing that's like an aberration to the norm. Illness is this weird fluke that'll, pass and then you'll get back to normal. And so care then is only required sometimes to meet it. Rather than if we just radically redid that and made illness and disability, as well as things like pain and need. And I say need on purpose. Need is like where people get very like about it. If you start talking about access, it's sort of a euphemism around this thing. But if you talk about need, it's very like we don't like need as a society. We don't like it. We don't like it when people need too much, right? But I cannot think of something that's more, it's just like actually to talk about ontology. I mean, it's the thing that defines all of us is that we need, each of us. Judith Butler once had a definition of the body that they were using, that it's anything that needs support. That any kind of body, like you can define a body as being a thing that needs support. So not only a human body, say, but like a social body, for example. And I like to truncate this definition and just say a body is a thing that needs. Because what else would support be but needed? Like I feel like it's redundant to add the support part. So anyway, I just think about that in terms of like how we conceptualize things like care is like, oh, well, they're only required in these moments of need. And the moments of need are few and far between if everything goes right. You know?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I guess that way of thinking about it is a thing that reinforces the idea of like a recovery, which is like a term that I often hear in my friends that are in kind of branches of like mental health support, like community support, not institutional support, but the idea of like anti-recovery, the idea of like not trying to return myself to a platonic ideal state of like fixing and then I'll be fine and then I won't need support because I'll have like cured this thing, but rather than like this is part of who I am and it's an ongoing thing. But yeah, like totally the idea of like that idea of like correcting is, and some point, and this applies to care as well in the way that it's like glibly used in an institutional way, is it becomes more about appeasing guilt or like a sense of obligation, and it's like that's the institutional care. It's like, well, we did the thing. It's like you had your 20 minutes in the crying box at work. What else can we give you? Sorry. And like that becomes a thing that like it nullifies any actual, validity of your needs, that, we have done the gesture and I'm sorry, but it wouldn't be practical to do any more than that. But thank you very much for a great question.
I feel like that is probably a good place to stop. Thank you both so much. I'm not going to say for being so generous, but for convincing us that we don't want to be platonic ideals. Thank you for being here this evening. For those of you who haven't already, Hedva's book is available outside, courtesy of Dead Ink Books. And if you already have your copy, Hedva will sign them. So thank you all very much for being here. And thank you, Uma, and thank you, Hedva, for